All right, let's just jump right into it. When you think about medieval weapons, you probably picture these gleaming swords, noble knights, the whole storybook thing. But the reality? It was so much messier, and honestly, way more creative. This isn't a story about chivalry. It's about a deadly design problem that just kept getting worse, and the brutal, desperate ingenuity that was the only way to solve it. So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to follow this story through 6 key phases. First, we'll look at the core problem, this unending arms race. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty with crush, puncture, repeat. After that, we'll see how distance itself became a weapon and how new tech armed pretty much everyone. And finally, we'll talk about how the most powerful weapon of all wasn't steel, it was fear. And this quote right here from our source material, it just absolutely nails it. Forget the poetry. Forget the romance. This was all about desperate, panicked innovation, where the only thing that mattered was surviving to the next iteration. Yeah, this whole myth versus reality thing is so important to get. Forget elegant duels and fancy swordplay. The only question that mattered on the battlefield was brutally simple. Did it work? Yes or no? And pretty much every weird, terrifying weapon we're about to look at is a direct answer to that question. Okay, so that brings us to our first section, this unending arms race. See, it all kicked off with a really simple but really big problem. Armor just kept getting better and better. And as it did, a knight's main weapon, the sword, started to become, well, kind of useless. A simple cut just wasn't going to cut it anymore. Which, of course, leads us right into our second section, crush, puncture, repeat. Suddenly, warriors were facing this massive hurdle. The sword just stopped working. You could slice at a guy in full plate armor all day long, and all you'd get was a loud clang and a really awkward pause in the middle of a battle. So that brings up this fantastic question. I mean, seriously, what do you do when your enemy is basically a walking piece of cookware? Loud, confident, and almost impossible to open. Well, you stop trying to get through the armor, and you start punishing the person inside of it. And for that job, you have the mace. This weapon is just blunt force trauma with confidence. It completely sidesteps the whole problem of needing a sharp edge. Its entire job was to transfer so much kinetic energy that, yeah, the armor might hold up, but the person inside would be, well, let's just say they wouldn't be getting up again. The real genius was in those little ridges on the head, the flanges. They focused all the force of a swing into a tiny area, denting helmets, cracking ribs, and breaking bones right through the steel. And maybe the best part, no edge to sharpen, no complex techniques to learn. If you could swing a heavy stick, congratulations, you were ready to go.
Now, if the mace was just raw frustration, the Warhammer was that same frustration after it went and got a graduate degree. This was a much more focused precision tool, and it sent a very, very clear message to any knight: all that money you spent on armor, yeah, that was a mistake. The Warhammer was a brilliant 2-in-1 design. You had the hammer face on one side for just crushing, bone-shattering force, and on the other, you had this nasty spike. They called it a beak. That was just perfect for punching through the weak spots, like the visor on a helmet or the joints in the armor. It was basically a medieval can opener for people.
So beating up armor when you're right next to it is one thing, but that created a whole new problem, the tyranny of distance. What if you just didn't want to get that close to begin with? It didn't take long for soldiers to realize that getting into a brawl with an armored knight was actually optional. So how do you stop a knight from a safe distance? It's simple, with a really long stick, a polearm. The strategy was easy. Step 1, use your reach to make his sword totally relevant. Step 2, stop the horse. A wall of sharp metal points tends to be pretty persuasive to animals. And step 3, once the knight is on the ground, well, gravity and your friends can take it from there. But what if your opponent has a shield, right? Well, that's when some weapon designer asked the most medieval question ever. What if the weapon didn't stop when it hit something? And the answer they came up with was the flail. As our source so perfectly puts it, this is physics with anger issues. It's a complete and total rejection of the concept of personal safety. But there was a crazy kind of logic to its chaos. That chain meant the spiked head could literally whip around an opponent's shield, making a solid block almost impossible. It was terrifyingly unpredictable. Of course, it was also ridiculously dangerous for the guys swinging it, which meant it kept both enemies and allies on their toes. And all of this leads to our next big shift, one that solved a massive problem for any army: Training time. Look, it takes years to train a skilled knight, but it takes maybe 5 minutes to make a peasant absolutely lethal. You just have to give him the right tool. And that tool was the crossbow. This thing completely flattened the battlefield. All those years of a knight's training, the expensive gear, the high social status, all of it could be undone by a simple mechanical trigger in the hands of someone who'd been training for less than an hour. The ruling classes were, to put it lightly, not happy about this.
All right, next up, we have a weapon that required pretty much zero training, the caltrop. This was weaponized inconvenience taken to its most logical and most spiteful conclusion.
The sheer evil brilliance of the caltrop was its simplicity. It's just a little piece of metal designed so that no matter how you throw it, one spike is always pointing straight up. It didn't kill anyone directly, it just made it impossible to move. It crippled horses, stopped cavalry charges cold, and it completely ignored armor, rank, or skill. Suddenly, the ground itself was your enemy.
Okay, so we've seen weapons for taking on individuals, but warfare obviously scaled up. And that brings us to the ultimate weapon, the one that really powered all the others, the architecture of fear. Because if you could break an enemy's will to fight, the battle was already won.
And nothing, I mean nothing, projected fear like a siege engine. When armies came up against giant stone walls, they decided the only logical solution was to throw buildings at other buildings. These things weren't just weapons. They were giant, terrifying statements that your safety, your walls, your entire world was temporary. And these siege engines launched a lot more than just rocks. They threw fire to create chaos, and sometimes even diseased animal carcasses to spread terror and sickness. But the psychological attack, that started way earlier. The engines were often built right there on site, forcing the people inside the castle to watch, day after agonizing day, as the very instrument of their doom was being assembled just outside their walls. And that was the ultimate point of it all. Steel, spikes, fire, they were all just tools. The real target was the mind. A broken army doesn't need to be killed off one by one. It just needs to be convinced that it's already lost. Fear was the weapon that dismantled armies from the inside out. So this brings us to our final section and the big why behind everything we've talked about. What was driving all of this brutal, sometimes twisted ingenuity? It wasn't just cruelty or some love of violence. It was a desperate, panicked, and deeply human scramble for one simple thing: survival. Think about it. Every single weapon we've seen was an answer to a terrifying problem that someone faced and probably barely survived. They went home that night thinking, okay, that can never happen again. Which leaves us with a pretty chilling final question to think about. In a world where survival is the only rule, are there any limits at all to human creativity?